I have a friend who claims to be a Christian. He believes the earth is flat and denies Paul's apostleship and writings. How do I discuss these matters with him?
Well, the first question that comes to my mind is, what does he mean when he says he's a Christian? All right. He must have some definition in his mind, some sense of what a real Christian is, that he would characterize himself as one. It's hard. It's hard to be a real Christian and dismiss Paul. For one, you said Peter in 2 Peter chapter 3 describes Paul's writings as Scripture. You have in Galatians 1 an account by Paul himself of going to the pillars, and that would be Peter, James, and John, and bringing what he understood Jesus to have taught him to them for verification to determine whether, as he puts it, he'd run in vain. And yet he was received fully as a brother, and his doctrines were received. And so it's I'm just curious why a person would say, Paul's out. And there have been traditions of in the broader Christian movement of taking whole sections of Scripture and just discounting them. I think the Manichaeans early on were, they said the Old Testament is. They liked Paul. They didn't like the anything Jewish. I'm not
the
sure.
Marcionites?
Or maybe the Marcionites.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, the Manichaeans were later. The Marcionites. Thank you. And so, I mean, you just have you have these things happening where it's just odd. Why reject Paul 2,000 years after the fact when the entire church, almost without exception, accepted everything that Paul had written? Now, he had to defend his apostleship. And you see this in 1 Corinthians, or 2 Corinthians especially, because there were naysayers that were after him. There were people, he says in Philippians, that were preaching the gospel out of competition with him. And he said, well, whether in pretense or in truth, the gospel's preached, so okay, they're fine with me as long as the truth is communicated. He wasn't taking it personally. So there were naysayers, but as a whole, if Paul was the author of a letter, the church characteristically accepted it, hands down. It was canonical. So that's why I'm kind of curious about why this person rejects all the Pauline writers. Now, I suspect he's got an unusual definition of Christianity. And this is where, using the first Columbo question over and over and over again as it applies to different parts of what he says. What do you mean by that? What's going on here? Give me a clear understanding of your view. Will help Fran to know what she's up against. Okay? But you want particulars. You want specifics.
Right.
I suspect this person has some reasons because this is an unusual view. I reject everything Paul wrote.
And it's unclear if he's saying he doesn't think Paul really wrote them. That's what I thought by denying his writings. But it sounds like if he's denying his apostleship, even if he wrote them, it wouldn't matter because he's denying him as an apostle. So I agree, Greg. I think you need to get more information. Why do you reject them? Do you think they don't fit with what Jesus said? And I know there are some people who say that. And if that's the case, now you have to explain how those things fit with what Jesus said. Mm-hmm. Explain that the people who Jesus trained accepted Paul as teaching the truth. And like you said, Peter refers to his writings as Scripture. So he's got to wrestle with that too. There might be something there, Fran mentions that he believes the earth is flat. I don't know. I'm not sure that has much to do with here. I think I would focus on Paul first, but there might be some underlying thing beneath both of these positions, and that might be why Fran brought them both up.
Yeah, and I'm not sure what to say about this, and I want to be careful. I don't want to sound condescending, but somebody who believes the earth is actually flat, it's hard to take seriously the other things that person believes because something is wrong. And if he thinks, I'm not sure if he takes that on what he thinks is biblical authority or not, But I've been in 5 continents. You can sit outside. You could go down the 405 freeway at twilight, past the airport, and you could look at the planes that are approaching, and you can see the curvature of the Earth reflected in the approaches of the planes. They're wrapping around. The furthest ones are actually lower, but they're not lower in elevation. They are lower visually because of the curvature of the Earth. So people knew that the Earth was round or spherical, whatever, even before the Egyptians knew this. This is how you could see it in an eclipse. You see the shadow in the eclipse. So I don't get it.
Unfortunately, I think this is more widespread than I would like. There might be somebody listening right now who I think it was last year I had somebody at our reality conference argue with me about whether or not the Earth was flat, and she wanted to make her case that the Earth was flat. And what she was saying is she was citing certain verses, and that's why I think what might be behind this is a hermeneutical problem. So it's a misunderstanding of how to interpret the text, and that leads them to not understand how Jesus, what he says, can fit with Paul. Therefore, Paul doesn't seem to make sense.
Yeah.
So I think there might be some sort of hermeneutical issue. You might want to start there.
Yeah, and keep in mind that so much of what people say about things, and this includes biblical writers, is the language of appearance. So I can look at my iPhone now and still see on the weather thing for Thousand Oaks, sunrise and sunset. But of course, the sun isn't moving at all. It's the Earth that's spinning. But appearances are that the sun is rising in the east and setting in the west. And we talk about that all the time, even though we know, strictly speaking, literally that's not what's going on. So it's normal for anyone to describe the Earth in a flat way because from the position of almost every observer, that's exactly the way it looks, unless you're on Mount Everest, and then you could see something more or something like that. You get my point.
And you might
That's
also
hermeneutical. Right?
Yeah, you might also ask Fran if he sees those two as related, and maybe he has already mentioned that, and that's why you ask both those things together to us because it does seem like an odd combination. Maybe those are just the two things that stood out to you. But hopefully this gives you some ideas about where you can take this, and you can have a good conversation with your friend.